think there's tremendous optimism about what's possible and also tremendous recognition that there are a lot of hurdles. And I think that these regulatory issues we've been talking about, not just the fact that there are regulations, but the fact that they're so complex and hard to navigate and changing quickly is definitely the most daunting challenge that we're facing.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. We're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's another installment in our signature multi-episode series that we produced in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. This is the second in a four-part series we're doing with Skadden, one of the truly renowned global food and drug law firms. This four-part series is called FDA's Regulatory Revisions, Business and Legal Impact on Industry. That's what we're going to be focusing on, the business and legal impact on industry. In part one, we covered the impact of pharmaceutical and biologics regulations. We are going to be discussing today the impact of FDA regulations on medical devices. So let's meet our guest right now. First, Rachel Turow. Rachel was on our last episode. She's the head of Skadden's FDA regulatory practice. She has almost 2 decades of experience in food and drug law. She deals with a wide range of FDA issues. She formerly was at FDA as regulatory counsel and served as in-house counsel at multinational companies. Welcome back to FDA Watch, Rachel. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Wayne. Great to be here. Nice to see you too.
Also joining us today is Bill Ridgway. He's head of Skadden's global cybersecurity and data privacy practice. He's a former federal prosecutor with extensive trial and investigative experience. He advises companies on the most sensitive cybersecurity, data privacy, artificial intelligence, and white-collar matters. Welcome to FDA Watch.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Looking forward to it.
Let's welcome Michelle Gasaway. Michelle has almost 30 years of experience at Skadden. She provides capital markets representations to public and private companies, private equity sponsors, investment banks, and other investors. She also counsels clients on disclosure issues, IPO preparation, and public reporting. So welcome to FDA Watch. Michelle, good to meet you.
Thanks, Wayne. Very excited to be here.
Our final introduction is Carolyn Bruguera. She's Vice President and General Counsel of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association. This is a trade association that provides educational and advocacy assistance to medical technology companies. She has extensive experience as a legal executive in the medical technology industry. She's advised on anti-kickback issues, data privacy, and transparency matters. Welcome to FDA Watch.
Thanks very much, Wayne.
So let's start with a question for Rachel. FDA's updated wellness guidance seems to be aimed at making clear which products should and shouldn't submit a 510K. It creates a challenge for companies to decide what to do with their wellness products. And there are a lot of wellness products that could go either way. I want to ask you, Rachel, what should companies consider when they're deciding whether or not to submit a 510K for a product?
Thanks, Wayne. It is a really interesting situation with a lot of wellness products, especially when companies are transitioning from, startup mode to more mature company. That's when deciding whether or not to pursue FDA clearance sometimes comes into play. And for a lot of companies, they've had a lot of success on the market without ever interacting with FDA. But for example, they want to add features or make claims about a device that then bring it outside the scope of what might be allowable as a general wellness device. And at that point, there are a lot of different considerations. Some of those considerations involve what types of claims they really want to make, what are, essential for the growth and success of their product versus what kind of flexibility do they want to have by staying outside of the regulated space. And those questions are often challenging to answer without taking the entire picture of where the business is into account. So for some companies, it's really worth it to pursue the 510K, even though it requires a lot more diligence and quality systems regulation, adherence, much more evidence to support the 510K clearance versus keeping things on file or just making general wellness claims. But it also affords more flexibility in terms of reimbursement, in terms of the legitimacy of the product. Being able to say it is FDA cleared, I think is often very valuable. And it also takes away the risk from a lot of these companies that FDA may come calling at some point, because there is in the consumer products area a risk that remains if you are one of those companies that's on the fence of, is FDA going to take notice of this product, and are they, for example, going to call it out to retailers, or are they going to issue a consumer alert about it, or are they going to come directly to the company with a warning letter or some other kind of enforcement? And if you pursue clearance, it takes that away. And there may be other reasons why that's very valuable. So there are a lot of things to consider. We're seeing companies go every direction on this, including many that should be or are falling outside of the exemptions, that want to broaden those exemptions for greater flexibility. And so it really is all over the board depending on the company's goals.
Yeah, Michelle, from a capital markets perspective, what are the benefits and downsides of getting FDA approval? I'm thinking about, does it affect how a company is viewed, how reimbursement works? Rachel mentioned reimbursement, the value of the company, implications for sales. Give us a perspective on how a company should think about it from a market standpoint.
Sure, and those are all great things to flag, Wayne, because what you really want to do is sort of step back and ask, as Rachel alluded to, how does it fit into your story? What is your business? How are you driving growth and revenue? How do you want to scale your products and scale your business? What is your go-to-market strategy? And some companies will say, hey, you know what? I want to be a certain type of company. I may not want to add all these features. It's not in my business plan. That's not where I'm going. And that can certainly be a decision. But for those companies who have this as their business plan, that they want to add features that may fall within the gray area, as Rachel discussed, or they're not sure and they want to have the optionality and the flexibility, going ahead and pursuing the FDA clearance can be really valuable, because one of the first questions that you'll get if you're doing a capital raise or from investors, or you look forward toward an IPO, is explain to me your product strategy, your go-to-market strategy. How are you going to scale? How are you going to grow? And if your answer is, well, I'm going to add ABC feature and XYZ feature, and those fall either clearly within an FDA clearance arena or in the gray area, you want to be prepared and proactive and have the response ready to investors when they say, okay, well, are there regulatory hurdles to this? Are there regulatory impediments? Because any investor or financing source in this space will be well informed of the rules, at least being able to talk enough about them to ask the questions. And they'll be watching what consumers are doing. They'll be watching what competitors are doing. And so the more that you can be prepared to answer those questions, and the more that you can reduce uncertainty, because the one thing investors in the market don't like is uncertainty. And so to the extent you can have thought about this in advance, prepared in advance, and have those responses ready to go, depending on your business, it can really help you.
How do you go about doing diligence in this area? What kinds of how do you make sure that you've got the answers to all the investor questions and that you can answer comprehensively and honestly?
Well, the first step is to actually call someone like Rachel to get her on your team because you want to understand the legal overlay. And it's very hard for companies who are really running their business to stay on top of an area such as this that is just constantly innovating and innovating both legally, but also innovating products that are just way ahead of where the laws are. And so having someone on your team to really guide you through the state of the law and where the gray areas are and things to think about and help prepare you to respond to those questions, I would say is first and foremost, because you are going to get diligence questions from the investors and you want to be prepared to have thought about it in advance versus sort of on the fly. And so that is the first recommendation that I would make for companies. And secondly, from a business perspective, have your story ready to go. How does the scaling and all of these products fit within your story? How are you prepared to support your revenue growth? What is your plan to get approval or clearance or not get approval or clearance? What are your decision points? Just think of all of those in advance before you get in a conversation with investors or financing sources on due diligence.
Rachel, one question. Do you ask FDA whether your device is subject to clearance? How does that process work?
I think you only ask that question if you want the answer to be yes. I have never seen FDA say, no, go ahead. You don't need to come in for clearance. I think that's highly unusual, especially for a device that's kind of on the cusp. And I think, to Michelle's point, that if you are in a position where you're about to do a major transaction, for example, or about to go through diligence, you ask that question and you get an answer you don't like, you now have a regulatory record that you are not complying, which is a really difficult place to be. I mean, I think we've seen so many companies very successfully navigate through the gray area and doing so really advocating for themselves and telling a very clear story, as Michelle said, and sticking to that narrative. And that, to me, is a better position than asking the question, getting an answer you don't like, and then having to change the entire story. So I think the device area is really fascinating because it is so risk-based. And Carolyn can talk a lot about this, but every single decision around devices is really a risk-based decision, more so than I think in any other FDA regulated space. And the risks are not always totally clear, but I think that calculating them the right way is how this ends up paying off. And so if you want the risk if you're okay with the answer to that question being yes, then by all means ask it, because FDA is a great partner in getting innovative products to market and getting them cleared in the right way. But if the narrative is, no, I'm not regulated, I don't think going to the regulator to ask is the right strategy.
I do want to turn to Carolyn. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about AI. Every industry, and especially the medical devices industry, is getting involved with AI. We see a lot of hype around AI. It's being integrated into every aspect of healthcare. And FDA obviously is intimately involved. Carolyn, what kind of things are you advising the members of your organization in terms of how they should approach thinking about AI in a regulatory context?
Well, the real challenge with AI is that regulators are still trying to find a balance between encouraging innovation and protecting consumers and patients. So the regulatory landscape is shifting quickly. Technology's evolving quickly. Government priorities are shifting. And it's not just FDA. There are other federal laws and agencies that are implicated. You have HIPAA and you have FTC, and there's a rapidly growing list of state laws that have been enacted or are pending governing data privacy generally, or in healthcare, use of AI generally, or in healthcare. And so you almost have to have a crystal ball to know what product or marketing strategy is going to be compliant. And of course, I'm just talking about the US right now. If you look at the EU and the rest of the world, things are even more complicated. And sometimes the regulatory approach taken is really different. But there are some basic principles that governments and organizations are coalescing around. So that's at least a helpful starting point. But the other thing is you really have to do your homework. And as it's already been touched on, you really need to think about, what your not just what your legal and compliance strategy is, but what your business model is, what your marketing strategy is. And so I think doing your homework is really the best advice I can give.
Among your manufacturers, is AI a dominant topic of conversation?
Well, it's a very important topic, and it really depends, obviously, on the product. I think everybody is talking about it, either using it in their products or just using it in their business, which raises lots of issues, both healthcare related and otherwise. So it is a dominant topic, but how that plays out on a product by product basis really varies tremendously from company to company.
Right. I want to shift gears again, bring Bill in here. Bill, you recently sent out a client alert that focused on a recent DOJ, Department of Justice settlement that signaled an increased cybersecurity risk for life sciences companies. Could you elaborate on that? Your concern about cybersecurity involving specifically life science companies?
Yes, of course, and it may not be something that maybe every life science sector may have be paying attention to as much as some of these other issues, but it's certainly a real risk for those companies. So this goes back to an initiative that the Department of Justice launched 5 years ago as part of their civil fraud initiative, and they are looking to try to identify circumstances in which companies may be misrepresenting their cybersecurity or might maybe not be in compliance with cybersecurity regulations that could apply. And it's mostly focused on the kind of the government contractors, but more recently, as we highlighted in the article, there has been some resolutions with medical device manufacturers and in the life sciences sectors more generally. And in those circumstances, these involve situations in which basically a whistleblower at a company will believe that there's something that the company is doing wrong with respect to its cybersecurity or its representations about what it's doing to the government or to other parties, and then can file a claim, and then the Department of Justice may pursue the case. And that's what happened in this circumstance, where the DOJ, Department of Justice, investigated the business, identified shortfalls in the company's cybersecurity, and including in areas that raise potential risk to patient safety. And in those circumstances, this was a pretty large settlement that they were able to secure. So it's a risk that is obviously the cybersecurity and data privacy are issues that lots of regulators have top of mind. But not everyone always considers or thinks about the risk that a whistleblower within the organization could make a report and that the Department of Justice could get involved, because obviously that has a number of reputational impact from an investigation like that.
Right. Well, we've covered 3 topics. We've covered whether or not to seek FDA approval. We've covered cyber security. We've covered AI. We're going to take a quick break now, but we'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking with Rachel Turow, Bill Ridgway, Michelle Gasaway from Skadden, and Carolyn Bruguera from MDMA. I want to shift gears again and talk about privacy. That's another issue involved with medical devices. Michelle, what are the top privacy issues for medical device developers? When you're looking at a deal, either raising money or going public or doing a merger, how can the privacy risk be best mitigated? And, what will investors or third parties look for in that space?
So that is a great question because privacy is a hot topic for every company these days, but it's especially heightened when you're talking about a company that's gathering personal data, medical data, health data, which everyone is concerned on what is being collected, what happens to the information when it is collected. We just talked about AI. If the company has AI agents, what are the AI agents doing with my data? How are they reviewing it? How is it being analyzed internally? And so I think the most important thing that a company can do, again, is prepare in advance, look at your privacy policies, look at your terms and conditions, make sure that they are up to speed based on current regulations, including individual regulations in the jurisdiction that you're in. State in California, for example, has its own particular privacy policies that are very much heightened and very consumer focused. And so the best that you can do is, again, talk to your counsel in advance, make sure your policies are the latest and the greatest policies so that when you get in a question from an investor or a financing source, hey, what are you doing with your data? How are you safeguarding it? You can easily point to those policies and point to your terms and conditions and say, this is what we're doing. And we've actually reviewed our policies recently, and they are up to speed on all of our jurisdictions that we need to comply with.
And you can say that, but how does if I'm an investor and I'm concerned about the possible privacy issues, how do I go about doing my due diligence to make sure that the company is really doing what it says it's doing?
So privacy is a great question to really focus on. Every company faces questions about information gathering and privacy, but it's especially a hot topic for anyone who gathers personal information, medical information, health information, not only what they're gathering, but what they're doing with it. How is it being used? Who has access to it? Is there an AI agent that's taking the data and interpreting it in certain ways? And so if you're a company or you're an investor, one of your best resources here is to talk to your privacy counsel, make sure your policies are up to date for whatever jurisdiction that you have to comply with, including local jurisdictions like California that may have their own special rules. And then be prepared to answer questions from investors of, have you had issues with the policies, information getting somewhere that it shouldn't get, and just make sure that you are prepared to answer those questions in advance.
Bill, let me ask you about privacy.
Yeah, of course. One of the things, and I'm involved in the diligence process often in this circumstance, and it is surprising how much, how often we see the counterparty has really not thought through these issues. I mean, a lot of these data privacy policies are publicly available, so you can see when a company has not done appropriate updates. So that's a pretty obvious issue, or usually a sign that maybe the company is not fully up to speed on the privacy issues. And so, as Michelle suggested, getting your house in order before you're in the deal space is really important. And then likewise, some of the basic questions we're always surprised that sometimes companies find challenging, like what laws are you subject to? What is the data flow? Explain it with particularity. And if they cannot, again, that's usually a sign that there may be some issues here. And just to say it in this space, I think now certainly on the kind of the deal side of it, people fully understand that these are existential risks. There could be businesses who their business model may not actually be successful in compliance with the privacy regimes that we have have at play at this point. So it is a very important issue that we've seen really cause people to walk away from deals in some circumstances.
Really? That's interesting. Is that big an issue, Bill?
Yeah, I think there's been circumstances where I think we've had concerns whether the particular business model as it's being, as they have envisioned it, is actually going to be consistent with the law, or whether the risks are just too high that they're going to face a lot of, regulatory scrutiny, whether in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere. And we have certainly seen that be an issue that has, caused people to question whether to move forward with the deal.
All right. So it can be a deal breaker if you don't do the right thing with regard to the privacy policies.
Yeah.
Carolyn, any perspective on this from MDMA?
First, I think that's a really important point that Bill just raised, because it's not just having the right policies and procedures. If you have a business model that depends on you doing something that increasingly is becoming illegal, it's obviously not going to work. And so I think understanding from the outset what your data flows are or will be and where the law is or how it's evolving is really important. But I do want to point out that for companies, the challenge is enormous right now, small and large, but especially for a company that's just starting out, because the laws are, we have half the states now probably have comprehensive data privacy laws and or health data laws that are new, and they're still figuring out the kinks. And as I touched on before, you've also got the whole rest of world, including the European Union with its robust data privacy laws. And understanding how those work and actually managing those in your business when they're all different from each other is unbelievably challenging. And we still don't know what the future holds. Those things are evolving every day. So it's a real challenge. And I do think, as with AI, that there are some principles that companies can start out with to at least help ensure that they are hopefully going to be on the right side of things as the laws evolve.
Yeah, I never thought of privacy as being such a major issue, but as Bill said, it's a deal breaker in some cases. But that's an interesting perspective. I want to cover one last topic, and that's telemedicine. CDRH at FDA has been the least disrupted of all the centers, and health tech is booming, and telemedicine is coming in, and we have AI-based technologies. For companies in this space, what are the biggest things to watch out for from each of your perspectives? And what are the things that FDA can be more helpful in doing and addressing to ensure companies are bringing products to market in a responsible way?
It's a great question, Wayne. We didn't touch at all on what has happened to FDA over the past year, but I think it's very relevant to the question that you just asked. Because with the staffing changes at FDA, we are seeing a change in the type of advice the agency is giving, the rate at which it's giving advice, and the accessibility of the staff to companies that may be in a nascent state or may not be experienced enough to navigate the regulations on their own or have such a novel technology that they need a lot of feedback from the agency. And so I think being really diligent about getting in front of FDA and in a comprehensive way and keeping an eye on the staffing levels, who is providing the guidance, what types of issues are really critical, and pushing the agency to be more transparent about the types of guidance and updates to regulations that would be helpful in this space. I think that's going to be critically important for a lot of these innovative products because they are charting new territory, and that's always something that has to be done in concert with the agency.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up with you, Rachel. You were at FDA for many years. We're at the end of March here in 2026. Is CDRH? Would you use the word stable in terms of its approach to regulation these days? A lot of disruption, but has it stabilized?
I think CDRH was the least affected of all the centers. That doesn't mean it wasn't affected, but I think it is probably the most stable. I think the challenge is that because there has been such a curtailment of guidance, which is really the lifeblood of FDA and industry in terms of regulatory compliance, it has been challenging to navigate the new FDA in the way that we see it now. And so I think that's the real challenge. It's not necessarily the stability because, CDRH is the only center that has a center director that predated the current commissioner. So I do think we've got stability from that perspective. But I do think the current regulatory environment is challenging in terms of ensuring that updated guidance and policies are communicated and are implemented with industry.
All right. Michelle, let me ask you about FDA. I know that you did not serve at FDA, but what's your perspective on how FDA is doing in terms of the areas that you deal with?
I'll make a little bit of an analogy here. I've spent a lot of time in the digital asset space as well, and it's also just similar to wearables. It's very innovative. It's the advancements in technology are moving incredibly fast, much faster than sort of laws that were put on the books a long time ago, where no one could even have anticipated you would have these types of innovations. And there, I will say people have benefited greatly from a very open and transparent regulatory environment in the last couple of years. It's been very different in the sense that people can get real-time feedback, they can have conversations, they can meet with regulators, so that there is more of a team effort and a partnership almost in bringing things to market and identifying issues up front and working with the regulators. And so that therefore you're best positioned for success when you can finally take your product to market or take it in to get clearance if that's what you decide to do. And so having an environment like that for an industry such as this, which is so poised for innovation and is innovating so quickly, I think would be a very welcome idea if something like that could come into this space as it has with other areas of the government.
Bill, any perspective on FDA? I know you come out of the DOJ, but how do you perceive what FDA is doing in the medical devices area?
So, my perspective, I would, I guess my vantage point is more focused on things related to like cybersecurity. And so, the thing that I would note is when you're talking about telemedicine and some of these more innovative products, there is a set of like a common understanding of some of the types of what are the core cybersecurity requirements that companies ought to be thinking about it. And it doesn't just come from the FDA. It's really, I think, comes from the broader regulatory landscape and kind of viewing various industries and regulators and understanding what are some of the core security requirements that we really need to build into this if we're going to be successful. And kind of having that being a core principle for how you're going to go about and build consumer trust. And so a little bit less specific to the FDA, but I do think there's a lot of good guidance from if you're looking out into other sectors where there has been some innovative technology and then also some regulatory guidance on what are some of the core pillars of what you need from a cybersecurity standpoint. That's going to be important in the years ahead.
Carolyn, I'm going to give you the last word on FDA. How do your manufacturers, your members, view what's going on at the FDA and what's gone on for the last year or so?
Well, I can't speak for all of our members. I think they've had different experiences, and clearly the last year has had its challenges. But I do want to pivot a little bit and pick up on a thread that Bill mentioned, which is, this isn't all just an FDA issue. The new and evolving technologies we're talking about, clearly we need an FDA that we can work with as things rapidly progress. But also, these technologies have issues that cut across legal regimes and agencies. So, really, having a regulatory landscape that acknowledges that, so everything's not sort of siloed, is just as important, I think. And then I do want to mention also that we can have the greatest technology in the world, but if the coverage and reimbursement from both the public and private sector aren't keeping up with that, it may not be accessible to patients. So,
Right.
So there's a lot to think about.
Right. So the medical devices industry has lots of challenges beyond just FDA in terms of what's been going on.
Absolutely. But a lot is going on that's exciting. So it's not all doom and gloom. I do feel that in the U.S. and internationally, governments are really trying to make sure that patients get the benefit of these new technologies. And it's really just finding a balance as things evolve really quickly. So that's really the challenge moving forward.
Yeah, just to calibrate from your perspective among your members, the confidence and the optimism of the industry. Can you just comment on that?
Well, I think there's tremendous optimism about what's possible, and also tremendous recognition that there are a lot of hurdles. And I think that these regulatory issues that we've been talking about, not just the fact that there are regulations, but the fact that they're so complex and hard to navigate and changing quickly, is definitely the most daunting challenge that we're facing.
All right. On that note, This has been a good discussion, talking about the business implications from FDA in the medical devices area. I want to thank all of our guests, Rachel, Bill, Michelle, Carolyn, for educating us about some of these issues and what's going on in the medical devices area. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levitt Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind those of you who are listening, if you want to find out more about our podcast, we've been on the air since January 25. Just visit our website, fdawatch.net. And we know you don't want to miss parts 3 and 4 of this series with Skadden or any episode of FDA Watch. The only way to guarantee you won't miss any episode is to subscribe. And you go to fdawatch.net and you'll see a place there where you can put your email in and you can subscribe. It's free and it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms and on our website. Again, fdawatch.net. Again, I want to thank our guests. This has been a good discussion. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. Signing off here.